Thank you all for being here. It's a comfort to look out and see so many faces from so many different points in my mother's life. Many of you know that I had the good fortune to have had an exceptionally close relationship with my grandmother, my Booby Ethel Goodman, who died at age 97 after making it to my wedding and knowing 3 of my 4 children. And one of the things I'm saddest about today is that my mother's beloved grandchildren, Sahava, Rena, Talia, Sammy, Leah, Vivian, and Yael, won't have that same chance to grow up with their Omi. These words are most of all for them, as well as for the many great nieces and nephews who also adored her. My mother was born in 1940 to her parents, Ethel and Shalom Goodman. She had an older brother, Irving, who is no longer with us, and a younger brother, David. Her parents were pre-war immigrants, very little formal education. And it was the 1940s and 1950s, when little girls were really supposed to get married and have babies and be beautiful, which she was. They certainly weren't supposed to study math and physics. But my mother excelled at the things she wasn't supposed to excel at. The entire household was silenced when she needed to study. She scored top grades in her high school provincial exams and won the Governor General's Medal. She was obviously brilliant, but when she tried to register for the courses she wanted to take in university, the men in charge of the program discouraged her, not really believing that a woman should pursue that path. And the men were not the only ones who asked that question. When she told her mother she wanted to study physics, my booby looked at her with horror and said, "Who will marry you?" Well, we all know the answer to that question. It was 1958. Her obnoxious younger brother, David, kept a list of all of the men who would call and ask her out. And he would check their names off as she either accepted or rejected them. And one day, someone named Stacey Freedhoff called, and she said yes. 2 weeks later, David threw out the list because the game was very obviously over. And the rest is history. They got married in 1960, and unlike many of their peers who began having children shortly after the wedding, they waited until after she finished her PhD, after she finished an overseas postdoc that he tagged along for, and until she was on her way to become what we believe was only the second tenured female physics PhD in Canada's history. At York University, she was a well-respected academic, highly regarded in her field of quantum optics throughout the world. She was a magnificent teacher. She sought ways to encourage the appointments of more women in the physics department. And she was also a mentor, role model, advisor, and physics mom to many, including my husband, Michael. And perhaps the greatest testament to that comes from her former student, Rudolph, who's here today from California. There are many words one could use to describe my mother. Quirky was an understatement. So is strong-willed. So is opinionated. As her daughter, I learned the words that described my mother in many ways. I remember that when she learned that at my junior high, all the girls had to take home economics and all the boys had to take shop, she got positively giddy when she threatened to sue the Hebrew school for gender discrimination. And it probably didn't hurt that the principal was someone she used to pick on when they were kids. The right and just response of the school was to change the requirements so that everybody had to study both. I threw out the hideous apron I sewed in home ec almost immediately, but I still have the wooden letter holder I made, somehow without amputating a finger, as a memory of that early lesson in how to right a wrong. I also remember being pulled out of school to watch her legal arguments in a proceeding intended to get her out of joining the York University Union on religious grounds. It all seems completely ludicrous to me now, but the fact that she fought the system using the tools of the system was something that I have vivid memories of. It's certainly not by accident that I got a PhD in physical chemistry, but now work for the United States Senate, trying from within the system to right things that are wrong. She was a living example of how to be a mother and have a career at a time when there weren't many examples like that, not just for me, but for her 6 nieces. There's another word that can be used to describe my mother, much to my surprise, and probably yours too, and that is mellow, which is one of her strongest Omi vibes. As a grandmother, she was unfailingly calm, quiet, and relaxed. She let the little people do her hair, destroy her kitchen, and be chased screaming gleefully through the house by their Zadie. She doted on my kids whenever she was with them, my sweet, emotionally intuitive, and kind Zahava, whom my mother adored spending quiet time with, my fierce, driven, yet vulnerable Rena, whom my mother could actually soothe and comfort no matter what, my little imp of a Sammy, whom my mother called her little ray of sunshine, and my bold and explosive Vivian, whose accomplishments my mother deemed nothing short of brilliant from the minute she was born. I'm so sorry for you and for her that your Omi will miss your graduations, weddings, babies, and other accomplishments. There's probably never a good time, place, or way to die. We're all still reeling from the unexpected shock of it all. From her perspective, though, we all agree that dying at the cottage, a place she loved more than all others, in a peaceful and painless way, was absolutely how and where she would have wanted it to be. I'm thankful for that. But for all of us, and especially for the little ones, it was definitely not yet time. She will be missed and will always be loved.
Okay. She had a lot of names. Ima was the first one I heard, and that was the first term of endearment. Ma, Henchi, Not Bubby. That lasted only a short while. And then Omi. And that's kind of how we all remember her, I think, now in our family. So many terms of endearment for such a warm and loving woman. And she welcomed me into her family with open arms and had a way of making me feel like I was extraordinary at every opportunity. She always had stale jelly beans waiting for me at both Alexandra Wood and at the cottage, and even attempted the ultimate feat in purchasing at one point some chocolate-covered jelly beans, which was, my 2 favorite things put together. We were both a little disappointed in the result, but A for effort. She was flowing with praise for the people that she loved, sometimes directly and at times indirectly. Not just her children and grandchildren and her husband of 57 years, who really showed her when about 50 years into their marriage, he cooked me toast and eggs at the cottage, proving that he isn't completely helpless in the kitchen. Her siblings and their spouses, her nieces and nephews, alike they all received words of praise that made them feel loved. She loved her children, even the one who would refer to her as the person whose house he grew up in. And she would tell me often how impressive their achievements were to her and how very proud she was of them. While their relationship was complicated at times, both Yoni and Henchi found ways to show each other that they were thought of and loved. From the month worth of school lunch tuna sandwiches that she would stock the freezer with when he was a child, to the pot plant she knowingly or unknowingly gave him as a teenager, to the R2-D2 toque that she knit for him a few years back. They were both big Star Wars lovers, and I don't think anybody supported Yoni's wedding march music selection more than his mother did. And Yoni found ways to let her know how much he loved her, including last week when he talked to her about taking her to Paris next year, because he wanted to make sure she felt as loved as Stephen, who he has been on many Scotch adventures with. And as Yoni so accurately noted in our conversations these last couple of days, there was never a conversation with Omi that didn't begin with "Hi, honey," and end with "I love you." My kids knew how much they were loved and cherished by their Omi, and they loved and cherished her right back. While she was self-admittedly challenged by imaginative play, she was ever eager to spend time with our children, reading, doing puzzles, taking walks, and discussing their interests in the world around them. When she discovered a few months ago that Leia had begun learning to knit at school, she immediately purchased knitting needles and yarn for all three of our girls and began to teach Talia and Yael as well. She had years before knit Talia a Dora the Explorer sweater when she was in that only Dora phase. She loved listening to Leia play the piano, an avid player herself. She adored hearing Yael read to her in both English and in Hebrew. And she was so proud of Talia for choosing to read from the Torah for her bat mitzvah that we all celebrated together in Israel last summer, taking such pride in putting on the talit that she chose for her, a gift that will be passed down through the generations to come in our family. And she was so proud of each of her grandchildren and would tell them so by phone or email when not in person. She took her time to really get to know each of them, their strengths, their talents, their challenges, their hopes, their passions, their dreams, and exhibited more patience with them than any other adult in their worlds. The only person I know with a Facebook account who has never once posted on her own or anyone else's timeline, she would email me and no doubt many others in this room after seeing some news to ask questions or share her own pride, praise, and excitement over the post, particularly those related to her grandchildren. She marveled at their physical strength and abilities, and she was genuinely impressed by their talents, creativity, and intelligence, and not surprisingly, very much so in all things math and science related. Like her incredibly lovely mother, Bobby Ethel, she never missed a birthday and had the uncanny ability to time the cards perfectly to the postal service. And then when she discovered e-cards, we would have two, each one clearly chosen with purpose to suit the individual to whom it was being given. And there are so many ways that we were all touched by Helen Freedhoff. No doubt the stories in this room alone would keep us talking for days. And I'm so sad that our time with Omi was cut short, but so very thankful for the opportunity that we all had to get to know the kind, intelligent, strong, loving, beautiful woman that will forever be in our hearts. And we love you, Omi.
So for those of you, many of you who don't know me, my name's Terry. I was, I guess, Helen's last PhD student, or close to her last one, at York University, where she was a professor of physics for so many years. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about Helen as a scientist, because I think it's an aspect many of you will not know about her. And of course, as a scientist, she had many accomplishments. When she was young, she won medals and prestigious research fellowships, and then she was one of the first female professors of physics. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about the way she thought as a scientist and what she worked on and how she thought about things. And Helen was very proficient as a mathematician. And mathematicians, you probably don't realize, are creatures that come in different varieties. And Helen was the type of mathematician that we call an algebraist. So Helen was extremely good at thinking about very abstract objects and doing calculations that went over many, many pages. And she's sort of putting together intricate relationships between these properties and somehow getting out at the end of many pages some answers. Okay? It's a type of mathematics that is often done, by mathematicians for abstract reasons. But Helen brought that to physics. And she used those talents to tackle problems that were fundamental questions about how light interacts with atoms. So the sort of basic processes, in fact, you wouldn't see the stuff around you. You wouldn't see the colors. You wouldn't see it at all if it wasn't for the fact that atoms both scatter off light and emit light when you shine other light on them. And so Helen's research focused on understanding those processes, particularly when we take strong laser fields and we look at the light that comes out of an atom. But she did these very abstract calculations, and these are the sort of basic processes, and most of the time they weren't related to experiments. Nowadays, funnily enough, the experiments are catching up with her work, but it's taken a long time. But she was just intrinsically interested in it, and she would do these intricate calculations far past the point where the rest of us would say, well, we just use a computer. And it wasn't that she didn't really trust the computer, although she had a tricky relationship with computers. She trusted us to run the computer. But it was that she really liked to see the mathematics come out. That's how she got a feeling, and this is what a physicist does like, to get this feeling of understanding something, of sort of seeing it, and not just the computer knowing what's going on, but her sort of gaining some more insight and understanding. And she really liked that process, and she did it in this, pages of calculations that I couldn't understand, no diagrams, no visualization or anything, just all algebra. But she had that thrill of science in her, and I remember one particular calculation. Helen was the first person to realize that if you took an atom of one particular color, and then you took two lasers, one of which was slightly bluer than the color of that atom, and one of which was slightly redder than the color of that atom. If you shine these two lasers on that, you get kind of a rainbow out. You get many, many different frequencies out, and you get an infinite number out, and they all have different intensities. And she described to me that she discovered this a few years before I joined her. And she described for me the thrill of that process of when she had just been trying and trying and trying to solve this problem, and then had essentially just sort of given up, and she was relaxing, I think on the dock at the cottage or something. And while she was relaxing, then she said she just suddenly saw the route to getting that solution, and then went through it quickly. And scientists don't get that very often in their lives. I've had it maybe twice in my own research career so far. And it's something that really sticks with you. It's part of the passion of why you do it. The problem for Helen with me was that my mathematical abilities, such as they are just completely different. I'm a geometrical person. I need to see shapes and diagrams. I don't have, I just can't communicate with someone who does algebra and vice versa. So we would just try. I was completely useless as a student. I would just, we would try and talk about things. And then eventually we realized that we better just try and do it our own way, and then see if we agreed on the sort of final things that came out. But in this process, we just had these long conversations that, for me, were sort of the first kind of real science that I was doing. And it's something that sticks with you because you just remember those initial calculations. And after I came to York, a few months into my PhD, we were sitting around talking, and Helen received a fax from some experimentalist. A fax for the grandchildren is kind of like a text message, but it's on paper. It fades much slower than a Snapchat or whatever they call it. And she had this fax, and it was on the kind that rolled up. And it was just showing some experimental data that just, to me just looked like a bunch of squiggly lines. And the experimentalists were really confused by what had happened. They'd seen a phenomenon, they didn't know where it came from, but they were really confident that this wasn't just noise, that it was something actually there. And so they'd sent it to her, and it was clear to me that Helen understood what she basically said. She knew immediately kind of the process that had led to this phenomenon. And looking back on it later, I realized that having now doing the same kind of thing myself, what you really want to do, and what she probably would have really liked to do, is run off. You've got this kind of cool thing here, and go and calculate it and solve the problem yourself. Okay. But she didn't do that. She just started the laborious process of explaining to me what that phenomenon was and letting me go do that calculation. And it took me months, many months, but it became the central part of my PhD thesis. And I think that shows you something about Helen's generosity. It wasn't just it extended to every part of her life. She was extremely generous. She was extremely caring about her students, not just her PhD students, also the students she taught. She had way more desire to see them understand stuff than I did. And so part of her legacy as a physicist, of course, are the people she trained, not just me, many others. I've had now 20-odd PhD students of my own, which means Helen has at least 20 academic grandchildren, so Michal and Yoni have a way to go. And it's wonderful that I think she has that legacy, and I love telling her about it. As time went on during this PhD, we spent a lot of time talking, and at some point Helen transitioned from being sort of an academic mentor to someone that I just really loved. There was just so many aspects of her eccentricities. And we spent many hours talking, and a lot of them were not about physics, but were about all of you, her family, her friends. She loved her family so much. She was so proud of everyone. She loved talking about all her friends. I think she thought of you as mathematical objects that needed to be put together in intricate relationships or something. And for me, this process where Helen became my physics mother and looked after me in so many different ways, I was always grateful to the Freedhoff family that although they might not have understood this completely, they sort of let it happen. And I learned, as I've gotten older, that this is sort of an unusual thing, to have someone who you just respect so much and care about as a person who is also an academic mentor to you. And I'm so grateful to them for letting me be part of this and being part of her life. And I'm going to miss her so much, as are all of you. And I think that, the only things I would like to say about this is that Helen, she had all those wonderful characters, and she was also a wonderful scientist. And I just wish there were more scientists like that. The field of science could do with more Helens, But what I really wish is just that she was still here today.
So, briefly, before I get into my prepared remarks, when we heard the news, I independently emailed Terry, did not realize my father had contacted him either. He was camping in California. He spent the entirety of yesterday so that he could come and join us here today. didn't make it onto one of his flights and ended up driving in from Detroit. Just as a testament to, both him and my mother. And I've warned my kids, I'm a crier. Apparently I got that from my Zaidi Shulam at my daughter's bat mitzvah. We were having just a lovely lunch in a restaurant in Jerusalem. It was only happiness. And I was blubbering away. I couldn't deliver a speech. I think I might be okay today, but I couldn't do it. And I had never heard this before about Zaidi Shulam, but my mother told me that apparently he would get quite upset with his inability to marshal in his emotions during these sorts of times. And we now don't have her to confirm that story, so I'm going to keep it as if it is true. My mother really was one of a kind. In her own way, she was a warrior for those things and people she believed in. As my sister said, she was a woman not lacking in opinions and who generally would not let trivial things like facts change her mind. With gentle hiccups from time to time, like my wife mentioned, not being particularly adept, perhaps, consequent to her grounding in sciences at playing fairy make-believe with my kids, she adored her grandchildren, and they adored her. As she was a doting, engaged, and ever-present Omi. As a parent, again, perhaps consequent to her background in sciences and processes, she also made some questionable choices, like, as my wife said, making our school lunch sandwiches a month at a time and freezing them in Ziploc bags to be distributed day by day. By the end of the month, regardless of the sandwich, but no doubt worst with tuna, by the time the sandwich had defrosted in our lunch bags, it was soaking wet. My mother and I were no different, I think, than any mother and son in that we had our moments, both good and bad. I found myself most challenged by her sheer force of will and her remarkable ability, seemingly regardless of background or training, to know the answer to any and every question, regardless of subject matter. But throughout it all, and regardless of anything and everything, the one constant in our relationship was her love. She was She was a fierce champion for me all her life. And without her help and encouragement, during my transition from being a fairly useless student to one who ultimately managed to figure out how to study, I know I would not have made it without her. I know I'll have many regrets and sad moments, as will we all, where she should have been there in the years to come, but will do my best instead to remember her as the strong-willed giant that lived in a tiny body who always did her best, and in her own ways, to express her heart of gold. Living in Ottawa, I didn't see my mother particularly often. We were lucky if we connected in person every 2 months or so. I can't tell you how much comfort I take from the fact that just last week, I was able to stay with her for the night, where she was able to come out and shep some nachas at an event I was involved with. That my mother was so visibly proud of me is something I've always treasured, though I doubt I ever told her. Our relationship was complicated at times, as are so many relationships. But the last conversation we had, I'd asked her to consider joining me on a trip to Paris, a city that she loved, and we would go next year. And then I, like I'm guessing every single member of my family, shared my last moment with her, hugging her and telling her that I loved her. If she were here today, aside from encouraging me to medicate myself beforehand, which clearly I did not, I know she'd be hovering around her grandchildren. She would want them to know that tears are okay, that they don't need to be scared, that it's okay if their parents and grandparents cry, that we're hurt, that we're not broken, and that time heals all, and that we're already on the path to healing, and that this is part of a life that will at times be full of joy, other times full of sorrow, and hopefully always full of love. I love you, Ma.